Haven't we all heard in Economics 101 that you continue any business only if you are not incurring repeated losses over a period of time? But still, we see this news. Zomato has reported a staggering 160% jump in its losses, which comes somewhere in the ballpark of 2,451 crores for the financial year 2019-20, whereas its revenues increased 98% from the preceding year. What's the answer to this? Let's have a look at how does startups work and how does their ecosystem look like. As trivial as it may sound to set the context for this video, it's very essential to differentiate the idea of a startup from that of a normal business. What's the one most important factor that divides any sort of profit institution to be called as a business or a startup is the one most important thing, that is idea. So, startup is basically a new way of doing things which can deliver value to customers. It may include, say, new services like Zomato, Ola, or it may include new way of doing old things like Make My Trip, Book My Show, new technology and many more. Whereas for comparison, business is any activity which has been done in the economy from say many years in the past and has been continuing, say steel, iron, textile, etc. So that's the main difference of what a startup and a business looks like. The main thing is a new idea to make people's life easier than it used to be while there was no existence of this new idea that we are talking about. So now let's have a look at how does startups funding look like and how do they actually get their finances. So any startup basically has many ways of procuring funds to run their own business. It can be via say through friends or families, through taking loan, or most important thing that we keep seeing these days is to sell their stakes to investors. And these investors can be a lot of people. They can say be a high net worth individual. These can be private equity firms, say major hedge funds who also are these days into funding newer ideas because of the potential that they see. So what is this main concept of idea that we have been referring to as the clinching differentiating factor between business and startup? To this clearly, let me give you a small example. Say if you start a restaurant tomorrow and you serve pizza, then that's a business. But at the same time, if you do some innovative work and you put that idea in the place and say you start serving gluten-free, fat-free sort of pizza where people, if they eat pizzas, it's even more healthier for them than it used to be while the business was existing in the early days, then that's the startup and that's the idea that we are talking about. The most important question that comes to our mind is, does an investor basically write blank checks to startups? No. Investors are basically these people who believe in the idea that we are talking about. So what they basically do is that they fund these ideas today in order to reap more benefits out of these ideas in the coming future. Because they believe that this idea that we are referring to is quote unquote going to change the lives of the people, and because of which the startup would have a lot of potential to tap into more people, and thus it would end up generating sort of more revenues. But still, we still left this question unanswered, that when these investors that we talked about are very experienced in the fields that they have already been, then why are they funding, say, loss-making entities like Zomato? There are a few explanations which goes into this, and it goes as per the time horizon of the startups. So say in the initial days of startups, there are a lot of expenses which, even though we may keep in the category of expenditure under the balance sheet, but still acts as a future brand building sort of investment. And these can be say in the fields of advertising, building infrastructure, building distribution channels, hiring employees, etc. So these are a few sort of sunk costs that the startups might keep incurring in their initial years of working. Because of these unavoidable costs, loss is something which is unavoidable, and it makes perfect economic rationale to overlook these sort of expenditures for a brighter future because of the investment that has been made in the brand building of this startup. One of the major reasons why these startups incur a lot of losses is because of the deep discount models that they offer. Be it any startup, say Zomato, Swiggy, Flipkart, etc., in their early days provide a lot of discount, and this is where a sort of debate starts between two group of individuals. There are few investors like Rakesh Junjunwala who talk about that these economic models are unsustainable. He basically gives us very witty analogy of how a son-in-law can keep getting, say, more funding from his father-in-law for this business and keep incurring losses and just keep getting money. Whereas on the other hand, some of the investors and some of the people who fund these startups have to say that they are basically taking these sort of costs in the short run to benefit out of these costs in the longer run. So now comes the most important question. What's the strategy of these startups look like? In short, there's just one strategy that every startup follows, and it's capture the market. Let's take a small example. Imagine, for example, today Zomato takes more than 60% of the food delivery business in India. Do we still think that remaining players would keep existing in the ecosystem? This becomes very tough for other players because now Zomato not only has a much larger control over the audience who are ordering food from their platforms, but now it also needs to spend lesser money in terms of the brand building work that it used to do earlier, and can also keep adjusting prices accordingly because now the volumes are so high in the startup that even though it may say incur a loss for say 1 month, it can afford to reduce down the prices, whereas those of say other rivals might not be able to afford the same thing. That's how a strategy of a startup looks like. In short, capture the market, and that is the major reason behind the rationale of incurring losses in the short run and keeping on increasing the sales from the short run to medium run to long run to keep building a business model. I'll give you a very short example of this, how this actually works out. We have a very small case study of how things played out in China between Uber and Didi. So Didi was one of the major local players in China who had much larger market capture in terms of taxi and cab market that Uber was trying to venture into. So even though Uber tried a lot to survive in the market in China, it actually couldn't do so in a longer period of time, and ultimately it had to sort of sell its stakes to Didi. Another factor to this sort of idea of loss-making startups increasing their revenues is IPO factor and the way how markets react. So Zomato is one of the major IPOs that the market is expecting in this year 2021. And the way markets react to any sort of business is with an anticipation of how it is going to perform in the upcoming period of time. And the only metric of doing is by having a look at the way their sales have been increasing. And that is the reason why, say, even a business and not a startup, even a business like Burger King, even though it had say losses in this current financial year, but had say increasing revenues, it listed at humongous listing gains, and it now is almost twice of the value that it listed. And this is justified because markets have a future anticipatory outlook of any business that the investors are going to put their money into. And to give the best example of this is the way how Tesla unfolded. So there are basically two type of stocks existing in the markets. One is value stocks and second is growth stocks. One we are talking about here is growth stocks. So growth stocks are basically those stocks who have a lot of untapped potential and which can be reaped into in the coming period of time. In conclusion to this video, I would also like to explain as to the importance of the economy in which these startups exist. So in countries like India, where there are favorable and stable policies, these longer term outlooks that we refer to are easier to expect, say, in comparison to countries where there is more terrorism, unstable policies, and because of which in stable countries like India, having this long-term outlook is easier for investors, and thus their dream of this idea is something which is not very far-fetched. Rationale behind keeping these startups funded, even though when they are in a loss-making situation, becomes a perfectly sensible decision. So that's how startups and their funding work like. I hope you derived some value out of this video. Thank you very much for watching.